Hello everyone, thank you for tuning into the show. We're going to be going over Federalist number 70 today. It is titled The Executive Department Further Considered, written by Alexander Hamilton, March 15th, 1788. Topics include energetic executive branch. Executive must be a sole head rather than a numerous body to attain the energy, expediency, and feasibility, and accountability with one head rather than an entire body of people that are far numerous or even a duplicity to people. So Hamilton pretty much writes this paper saying he introduces the four core components that make an energetic, forceful executive branch. So he starts off here and he states, and I quote, "Energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. It is essential to the protection of the community against foreign attacks. It is not less essential to the steady administration of the laws, to the protection of property against those irregular and high-handed combinations which sometimes interrupt the ordinary course of justice, to the security of liberty against the enterprises and assaults of ambition, of faction, and of anarchy." End quote. So executive branch, their job is to enforce the laws. Thus, they are tasked with defending your freedoms as well as protecting your property. These are the very few core essence of what government is supposed to do. It's supposed to protect your life, protect your property, protect your freedoms. Okay, so he goes on, Hamilton, he cites the story of Rome as an example of how a lack of energetic executive will cause a tumultuous downfall, destruction, and conquest by seditions of whole classes of the community. He adds, and I quote, "A feeble executive implies a feeble execution of the government. A feeble execution is but another phrase for a bad execution, and a government ill executed, whatever it may be in theory, must be in practice a bad government." End quote. So this is all kind of just building up to have a energetic executive branch. It's imperative to have a good government. And then this is when he kind of ends up dividing all the components of energy in the executive into four different classes. One being unity, two being duration, three being an adequate provision for its support, and four being competent powers. When he says unity, he means having this power solely distributed in one person. That is the unity. The duration, obviously, is the term limit, how long it is. And then the adequate provision for its support, I'm assuming, has to do with constitutional powers, have them laid out correctly, and then competent powers is kind of similar to number three. But in this one specifically, in this paper, he'll just be going over the first one, unity. So he states, and I quote, "Next, the ingredients which constitute safety in the Republican sense are, first, a due dependence on the people, secondly, a due responsibility." End quote. So, it's pretty simple. There's going to be a dependence on the people from the president, and this will ensure some sort of safety for the people, because then the president, his job is to protect the rights of the people and protect their property, enforce the laws. And then there's supposed to be, secondly, a due responsibility, as in that is the responsibility of the president, which I just stated, to protect the people, protect their rights, protect their freedoms, protect their property. So first, unity. It is conducive to the most significant element of the president, which is energy. Hamilton asserts, and I quote, "Those politicians and statesmen who have been the most celebrated for the soundness of their principles and for the justice of their views have declared in favor of a single executive and a numerous legislature. They have, with great propriety, considered energy as the most necessary qualification of the former, and have regarded this as most applicable to power in a single hand, while they have, with equal propriety, considered the latter as best adapted to deliberation and wisdom, and best calculated to conciliate the confidence of the people and to secure their privileges and interests." End quote. So here, what he kind of goes over is, politicians, statesmen, all these people have all said they've been in favor of having a single executive and then also having a numerous legislature, and this is kind of, there's been this weird idea in Republican styles of government to distribute the power out to numerous people always in every single branch of government. and that's why the legislative branch is built that way, but he kind of goes on to explain why the executive branch should not be built the way that the legislative branch is built. And it's because of what their role is in society, especially in terms of national security principles. So he goes on, he states next, and I quote, "Decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch will generally characterize the proceedings of one man in a much more eminent degree than the proceedings of any greater number, and in proportion as the number is increased, these qualities will be diminished," end quote. So dispatch meaning hastily being able to quickly act, secrecy, pretty simple. If you had to every single time, and I've mentioned this many times, if you had to, before doing any type of military execution, carrying out any military force, if you had to go through the legislative branch every single time, first off, it would diminish the dispatch of it, the speed of which it can be done, as well as the secrecy, because you cannot trust anybody in the legislative branch. Somebody like Nancy Pelosi, you can't trust any of them going to our enemies and our adversaries and telling them, just the way the government's ran, I would not trust anybody in the legislative branch telling them making any type of decision like this. So it's essential that we have somebody that can quickly make these decisions, make them secretly, and do it quickly. So in other words, the farther expanded the number in the executive magistrate position, as in the president, will provide the less unified it is on the forefront of making decisions of great importance that must be made in a hasty manner. The author continues by explaining the experience of other nations such as Rome and the Achaeans, where a numerous executive caused turmoil and dissensions that turned out to be fatal. So he goes on, he starts talking about the two consuls of Rome a little bit. He states, and I quote, "This unity may be destroyed in two ways, either by vesting the power in," and he's talking about the executive, either by vesting the power in two or more magistrates of equal dignity and authority, or by vesting it ostensibly in one man, subject in whole or in part to the control and cooperation of others, in the capacity of counselors to him. Of the first, the two consuls of Rome may serve as an example. Of the last, we shall find examples in the constitutions of the several states. New York and New Jersey, if I recollect right, are the only states which have entrusted the executive authority wholly to single men." End quote. So he says where this can really be diminished and destroyed is vesting the power in more than one magistrate, as in having more than one president of equal authority and dignity, having the same amount of power, or by vesting it in one person, but having every single act by that executive has to go through the legislative branch all the time, or has to go through a council of people, and that would just destroy and diminish what the executive power is. So next he goes on to state, and I quote, "Wherever two or more persons are engaged in any common enterprise or pursuit, there is always danger of difference of opinion. If it be a public trust or office in which they are clothed with equal dignity and authority, there is peculiar danger of personal emulation and even animosity. From either, and especially from all these causes, the most bitter dissensions are apt to spring. Whenever these happen, they lessen the respectability, weaken the authority, and distract the plans and operation of those whom they divide." End quote. It's kind of important. It says just because if you give this power to one or two or more people, you're gonna have people that disagree, and they're gonna have this difference of opinion, and because of that, there's gonna be some sort of personal emulation or even animosity that forms from this, which makes sense. And it also comes, I think he has this soon. Okay, so a couple quotes from now, he has this very interesting aspect in which politics actually plays today with the parties. And I'm going to explain it in a few quotes. But Hamilton believed that by assailing a numerous executive magistracy, rather than a sole holder of the position, they might, and I'm quoting here, they might impede or frustrate the most important measures of the government in the most critical emergencies of the state. So this power, shared among numerous participants, will cause bitter dissensions fueled by animosity and may split the country into violent factions. Hamilton describes the impetus behind this dissension. And he states, and I quote, "Men often oppose a thing merely because they have had no agency in planning," end quote. So men, in nature, we are emotional, we make stupid, rash decisions. If you actually look at chimpanzees themselves, and obviously from which we have evolved from some sort of similar subhuman-like species as we have evolved, chimpanzees are spiteful themselves. If you hand somebody food and you give that person more, if you train a chimpanzee, you give this person more food and then you give the chimpanzee a minimal amount, the chimpanzee will act insanely and will rip your face off. They will assault you. That is kind of the way that man works in a way, but a lot less, like, a lot more suppressive than that. If they have no agency in these laws, then they're not going to back them up, even if it seems to be a good law or a good perspective to hold. So next he goes on, and this is the part that really characterizes the way that politics works now, and it's very interesting that he's able to call this out now, that we really have not changed. It's been 250 years. We have been doing things the exact same way. And he talks about politicians specifically, or people that are looking to make law, right? He states, and I quote, "They seem to think themselves bound in honor, and by all the motives of personal infallibility, to defeat the success of what has been resolved upon contrary to their sentiments. Men of upright, benevolent tempers have too many opportunities of remarking with horror to what desperate lengths this disposition is sometimes carried, and how often the great interests of society are sacrificed to the vanity, to the conceit, and to the obstinacy of individuals, who have credit enough to make their passions and their caprices interesting to mankind." So he's saying just themselves. You have people that they think they have, it's the vision of the anointed, essentially. They are the anointed ones. They have so much honor, so much integrity, that nothing that they say or do, their motives are always virtuous, right? And this is what we see right now in politics in a general sense. We see it from the Democrat Party, is everything the Republicans do obviously isn't virtuous, because we're the virtuous ones. We're the ones that are bound in honor. We are the ones that are personally infallible. We do no wrong. We are perfect individuals. And this other side, simply because they disagree with us, they must be the bad ones. They must be the devil. And it's very funny that he can come out here with this, and it really does. It applies today the exact same way. So Hamilton explains that the concepts stated above are usually to be submitted to the creation of the legislature rather than the executive branch. So meaning, having this government, usually it goes to the legislative branch rather than the executive, having some of these powers in a free, what they would call a republican system or a free government. That's why this is a constitutional republic. It's a little bit different. We've never had this, and what really makes our country different, makes our form of government different than republics in the past, is that we have a federal system. Where there is a legislative branch, whereas with Republican-style governments, there's just a legislative branch, and the legislative branch also additionally acts as the executive branch, and the executive was always extremely weak, even if there was one. In this case, we actually have a somewhat stronger executive, while also having this legislative branch and having the judiciary, whereas usually all those powers were vested in just one council, which was kind of considered the Congress. Or rather, as they called it, the Congress assembled during the Articles of Confederation. And that's really what makes the difference between the two. So he's going to talk about this, how this system is different, and how laying those powers of the executive all in a council is a bad idea. So he states, and I quote, "Upon the principles of a free government, inconveniences from the source just mentioned must necessarily be submitted to in the formation of the legislature. But it is unnecessary and therefore unwise to introduce them into the constitution of the executive. It is here, too, that they may be most pernicious. In the legislature, promptitude of decision is oftener an evil than a benefit. The differences of opinion and the jarrings of parties in that department of the government, though they may sometimes obstruct salutary plans, yet often promote deliberation and circumspection, and serve to check excesses in the majority. When a resolution, too, is once taken, the opposition must be at an end." End quote. So he says, for what the purpose and what the task of the legislative branch is, it is good to have a numerous body, because they kind of fight. There's some circumspection. They analyze things much more deeply. But in the executive branch, if you get attacked on Pearl Harbor and you want to answer with an airstrike of your own in the executive, we can't sit there and duke it out in the legislative branch for the next couple of weeks. It needs to be quick. It needs to be hasty. And it needs to be a unified decision. And that's the reason why the commander-in-chief is held under the presidency. So Hamilton notes that differences of opinion, though they may obstruct plans, promote circumspection from the legislative perspective and prove to be beneficial for that reason, but this element in the executive branch will serve to embarrass and weaken. So Hamilton next he states, and I quote, "They serve to embarrass and weaken the execution of the plan or measure to which they relate from the first step to the final conclusion of it. They constantly counteract those qualities in the executive which are the most necessary ingredients in its composition, vigor, and expedition, and this without any counterbalancing good. In the conduct of war, in which the energy of the executive is the bulwark of national security, everything would be to be apprehended from its plurality." End quote. So yeah, this really sums up what the argument coming from Hamilton against his objectors is that you need to have that vigor, that expedition, and that composition of energy in order to run in the executive department, and to have a duplicity in the executive just would diminish that. So in terms of national security and secrecy, it is imperative to have one energetic leader, as he says. Now, Hamilton objects that a plurality in the executive tends to conceal faults and destroy responsibility. Responsibility is of two kinds: to censor and to punishment. That's another very important aspect of this. If you're going to have multiple people in the executive branch, you're going to have some sort of council, it's harder to cast blame on who the person is to be held accountable if there is some sort of oppressive or authoritarian acts, or there's just a bad decision being made. It's hard to cast blame on one of the multiple people that would be in that executive council. So he goes on next to state, and I quote, "A man in public trust will much oftener act in such a manner as to render him unworthy of being any longer trusted, than in such a manner as to make him obnoxious to legal punishment. But the multiplication of the executive adds to the difficulty of detection in either case. It often becomes impossible, amidst mutual accusations, to determine on whom the blame or the punishment of a pernicious measure or series of pernicious measures ought really to fall." End quote. So that's really the most important part of this, where he says at the very end, "To determine on whom the blame or the punishment of a pernicious measure or series of pernicious measures ought really to fall." So who's the person to blame for this that does something wrong? When you have multiple people that are running the executive branch, who is to blame? And then it really, in not knowing who, or not being able to blame anyone specifically, it just loses the accountability to the voters and to the constituency itself. And I just think it's very interesting in the very beginning, where he says, "Men in public trust will much oftener act in such a manner as to render him unworthy of being any longer trusted." So he knew at this time that government was never to be trusted in a general sense anyway. Most of the time they're going to end up rendering themselves unworthy of anyone trusting them. I just think that's so interesting that he just comes out straight up, flat out, and says it. So then Hamilton, he continues, "A plurality in the executive magistrate position will cause much more difficulty detecting either the case of censure or punishment." He states, and I quote, "It is shifted from one to another with so much dexterity and under such plausible appearances that the public opinion is left in suspense about the real author." End quote. So pretty much saying, real author, we don't know who's the one that's doing these things. To have that plurality, it shifts blame from one person to another. No one knows what's going on. There's no accountability. It's just a disaster, really. So Hamilton, he uses the example of New York, scandalous appointments that have ended in the governor charging the members with the blame of appointment off of his own nomination. And I guess there was some sort of council at this time when it came for him to appoint public officers or officials, public officials, which I remember actually we went over this, I think, last or the paper before this, how there was a nomination from the president, and then the appointing after that was a council of, I think, 5 or 6 people, and the president also had a vote in that as well. So in having this, now the president, or I'm sorry, the governor of New York can cast blame on everybody else that's in the council. So he goes on, he states, and he states this example, he says, and I quote, "In the single instance in which the governor of the state is coupled with a council that is in the appointment to offices, we have seen the mischiefs of it in the view now under consideration. Scandalous appointments to important offices have been made. Some cases, indeed, have been so flagrant that all parties have agreed in the impropriety of the thing. When inquiry has been made, the blame has been laid by the governor on the members of the council, who on their part have charged it upon his nomination, while the people remain altogether at a loss to determine by whose influence their interests have been committed to hands so unqualified and so manifestly improper, end quote. So he just keeps going on explaining more and more examples how there's no, you can't hold anyone accountable when you have a duplicity in the executive office. So he goes on next, he states, and I quote, "It is evident from these considerations that the plurality of the executive tends to deprive the people of the two greatest securities they can have for the faithful exercise of any delegated power. First, the restraints of public opinion, which lose their efficacy as well on account of the division of the censure attendant on bad measures among a number, as on account of the uncertainty on whom it ought to fall. And secondly, the opportunity of discovering with facility and clearness the misconduct of the persons they trust, in order either to their removal from office or to their actual punishment in cases which admit of it," end quote. So once again, you're just not going to be able to do the classic impeachment where you can pull up charges of impeachment, then confirm them, and then after that have a criminal trial. You can't do any of that when you have a plurality in the executive branch because no one knows who it is to blame. Everyone's just going to be pointing the finger, and it's all going to be considered kind of a hearsay-like situation. So in summation, a plurality in the executive would cause issues in terms of holding that executive responsible for fallacious acts and abuses of power, because all members would avoid scrutiny and charge it upon other members, rendering the opinion of the people trivial to enforce the integrity of the executive branch. And obviously at this time there was always a worrying of who the executive was because of Great Britain. So Hamilton, he hammers it home by detailing the council of the King of Great Britain. The council is responsible for the advice they give the king, but the king is treated with impunity from the decisions he makes. So he states it, and I quote, "He is the absolute master of his own conduct in the exercise of his office, and may observe or disregard the counsel given to him at his sole discretion," end quote. So there was supposed to be some sort of, I guess what you would call an impeachment-like process, but there was no removal from office. The council would just get together, and then they would send something to the king letting him know, hey, you're doing this wrong, we think that you're imposing your power authoritarian, tyrannically, and he would just say, okay, well, I don't care, doesn't matter, I can do whatever I want, really. So that being said, the idea of numerous executive councils stems from the maxim of Republican jealousy, which considers power as safer in the hands of a number of men than of a single man, because of the reasons of Great Britain in the old world, what we saw. We thought that republicanism, especially in the executive position, we thought that it would be better to have numerous, which in that case it just doesn't work. What we need to do is just be able to hold the executive accountable, unlike in the old world where the executive reigned power over everybody. So next he states, and I quote, "The idea of a council to the executive, which has so generally obtained in the state constitutions, has been derived from that maxim of Republican jealousy, which considers power as safer in the hands of a number of men than of a single man. If the maxim should be admitted to be applicable to the case, I should contend that the advantage on that side would not counterbalance the numerous disadvantages on the opposite side. But I do not think the rule at all applicable to the executive power," end quote. So he says he doesn't like the idea, really, of having this council, this separate council that approves every single thing that the president does, just because then you wouldn't be able to act hastily or quickly. You're better off just having the president there, the executive magistrate, in that position, and if there's anything that they do wrong, or we think that they're overpowering, or they're oppressive in the means of power, then we can hold them accountable through impeachment proceedings. At this time, the president really had no powers in terms. The only real powers that the president had is they could try to work out or negotiate some sort of treaty deals, but then those still had to be approved by the Senate. And the commander-in-chief really was the sole discretionary responsibility of the president, as well as enforcing some of the laws. But the only laws that the president really would enforce is federal laws, ones that are on the books in the Constitution or codified in federal law. And at that time, it really wasn't many. So the executive did not have a lot of power. At this time, the president has much more power now than they ever did, because there was no such thing as an executive order, which are unconstitutional directly. So Hamilton, he argues that the disadvantages of this principle practice on the executive far outweigh the advantages of this practice. So Hamilton, he notes Junius's writing. So when you ask who, you know what, I'll read the quote first and then I'll explain who Junius is. So he states, and I quote, "The executive power is more easily confined when it is one. That it is far more safe there should be a single object for the jealousy and watchfulness of the people. And in a word, that all multiplication of the executive is rather dangerous than friendly to liberty." End quote. So yeah, the people should keep a watchful eye, and that's the reason for having a single object. And the president nowadays gets more flack than anybody else that's in the government. Really, the legislative branch is responsible for a lot of our bad things. The executive is only really responsible for bad things that happen in our economy and all these other things when they're writing up legislation and they're doing executive orders, or they're the ones that are spearheading. Because nowadays, the way everything works, the president really spearheads the operations in terms of legislation. They call the legislatures. They say, "Hey, this is what we want to do federally. Write up the bill, whatever, what have you." That's what goes on currently with the Biden administration. That's kind of what went on with Trump as well. Everybody talks, but most of the power is coming from the executive in terms of legislation. And then, of course, executive orders are really to blame. So for example, if you want to talk about Joe Biden, you want to talk about the raising prices of, and then the Fed as well. But the Fed printing more money is of the legislative discretion, but Biden is the one telling the legislative body, "Hey guys, I want you to pass this. Hey guys, I want you to pass that." And then when they sign off on it, the reason why the president is held to such a standard is the legislative body. You go, okay, so there's 435 in the House, 100 senators, so we have 535 Congress members, and then we just have one president, and they're the ones that when this legislation comes to their desk, they don't veto it, they approve it. So everybody looks at the president all the time, blames them for everything. And so that currently still is true, really. But the difference now is that the president has much more power, and when they push forward with executive orders that are directly unconstitutional, then they are actually really truly to be blamed for that, as well as any military actions that have adverse implications. So Junius is a pseudonym for a writer that contributed to the series of letters, Public Advertiser in America. This was during 1769, 1772. It's kind of interesting because this was really before America had claimed its independence. I think this was in America, and the pseudonym came from Lucius and Brutus. Lucius Junius Brutus was a Roman patriot that overthrew the Roman monarchy years ago. So this is really where they came up with this name. No one actually knows who this writer is. And then there's some secret identity. They're saying that it was really Philip Francis, who was, I think he was like an Irish-born British politician, guy that handed out pamphlets. He wrote these serious letters of Junius. And I don't really exactly know, but I know that this definitely played a role, I think, in Great Britain in their politics, because I think that's what he was writing about specifically. So the Public Advertiser. The Public Advertiser is somewhere in Great Britain. It's the debates. He frequently attended these debates in the House of Parliament, so I guess that's what it generally had to do with him criticizing the government of England. This guy, this dude Philip Francis, who they think is the writer. They don't even really know who this guy is, truthfully. So next, just a little quick history lesson. I was interested in that too. I didn't really understand. So, when this power is lodged in the hands of multiple men, it is more liable to be abused and much more dangerous when abused rather than being in the hands of one man. Because then it also has the backing of multiple people too. You got to think about it like that as well. So next, he goes on to state, and I quote, "When power therefore is placed in the hands of so small a number of men as to admit of their interests and views being easily combined in a common enterprise by an artful leader, it becomes more liable to abuse and more dangerous when abused than if it be lodged in the hands of one man, who from the very circumstance of his being alone will be more narrowly watched and more readily suspected, and who cannot unite so great a mass of influence as when he is associated with others." End quote. So if you had the situation in the legislative branch, just think about it this way. If you had 3/4 of the legislative branch in this country, the federal legislative branch in this country, they were all corrupted, it'd be a really scary spectacle to have 3/4 of them corrupted because they hold so much power in that specific branch. And because there's so many of them, you would have to weed out every single one of them. Whereas with the presidency, you have that one person. If they're corrupt, okay, we only have to get rid of one person. And most of the time, they don't have that much power. I think that the power really to be worried about in overstep of power from the government is in the legislative branch. But unfortunately, the legislative branch has delegated so much power to the presidency that we also have to worry about them as well. And then the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, they don't really uphold the positions that they should be holding. A lot of them are about, like I mentioned in my last last weekend special, I was talking about Fauci, and all he cares about is the institution. We have a lot of people like John Roberts in the Supreme Court. All he cares about is the institution of the Supreme Court. He just cares about upholding the status quo. He doesn't want to make any brash decisions. He doesn't really care about the constitutionality. He just goes, okay, so what did the Supreme Court rule 5 or 10 years ago or 20 or 30 years ago? What was their ruling? Because that's all I care about upholding. I want to uphold that. I don't care about... He is not interested in upholding the Constitution. He's interested in upholding the Supreme Court. And that's really what the problem is. We have a lot of... and then we also have, forget it. We have people in the Supreme Court that are like legislators that are just so far leftist and they don't care about the Constitution at all. But I think that's what John Roberts' position is. I kind of feel that way a little bit about Brett Kavanaugh, but I guess we'll have to see these next couple of years what happens. So one man is more apt to be narrowly watched and suspected rather than a large group of men. Hamilton concludes that a council of the executive would cost the people more in public expenditures, and that the unity of the executive is one of the best features of the New York Constitution and the proposed Constitution as well. So yeah, if you have this council, you also have to additionally pay a bunch of people money, which nowadays we get taxed so heavily that wouldn't really matter. But at that time, when people actually liked economic and financial freedom, being able to rely on themselves instead of having the government take Social Security money from you and have them save it for you, you can save your own money and you can get your own piggy bank instead of having the federal government piggy bank, is really the idea. So he ends this paper with the very last quote. He states, "I forbear to dwell upon the subject of expense, though it be evident that if the council should be numerous enough to answer the principal end aimed at by the institution, the salaries of the members, who must be drawn from their homes to reside at the seat of government, would form an item in the catalogue of public expenditures too serious to be incurred for an object of equivocal utility. I will only add that prior to the appearance of the Constitution, I rarely met with an intelligent man from any of the states who did not admit as the result of experience that the unity of the executive of this state was one of the best of the distinguishing features of our Constitution," end quote. So he's talking about the state of New York, how they believe in that unity principle. They believe the executive magistrate should be one person acting alone, and then they have to answer to whatever they do later. That's really it for this one. I greatly appreciate everyone tuning in. The very next one, we're going to be going over... I think it's the duration of the office of the executive. So I think he's going to go through all 4 of these principles of energy. I don't know if he's going to go through single ones in every single paper, but we'll see. We'll end up seeing. So I greatly appreciate everyone tuning in as always. Please like, share, subscribe. I've been noticing we've been getting a little bit more flow than usual. So we've been increasing very slowly in subscribers and viewership. So I do appreciate anyone that passes the word, drops the mic on everybody, lets them know about the podcast. This is definitely what you would call different. It's a different media source rather than listening to the regular talking heads on Fox News who avoid the important topics, constitutionalism as well as cultural topics as well. So yeah, I greatly appreciate everyone tuning in. Please like, share, subscribe, hit that rumble, fist, and let people know about the podcast. I greatly appreciate it, and I will see you all next time. Thank you.